Good evening. Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a great honor for me to open this year's Edwin L. Godkin Lecture and extend a warm welcome to tonight's speaker. I think you've already heard through this applause, Mr. Secretary General, that you have many admirers here in Cambridge for the important work that you've done, and you can count all of us among them. The Godkin Lecture is perhaps one of Harvard's most prestigious lectures. It's named after a man who was born and educated in Ireland and immigrated to the United States in 1856. Became first editor of The Nation, a weekly publication, and later editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post until his retirement in 1900. During that period, he exercised an enormous influence on American public opinion and discourse. And in 1903, Edwin Godkin's friends established this lecture series in order to bring speakers to Harvard to discuss issues related to free government and civic responsibility. Past Godkin lecturers have included Adlai Stevenson, Nelson Rockefeller, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and our own William Julius Wilson. Once again, it's a privilege for the Kennedy School to have a lecturer in the Godkin series of this eminence. We're delighted to have you here, and while there are many people in the audience who know you personally, I want to single out one in particular and recognize John Ruggie, who is the Everin and Jean Kirkpatrick Professor here at the Kennedy School, and of course was your Assistant Secretary General in the UN and was so instrumental in bringing you here. And also, I should say, we're just delighted to have him in this important chair here at the school. To introduce a Secretary General requires a president, and we have no better man to do that than the president of Harvard, Lawrence Summers. Larry?
Thanks very much, Joe, and thank you for everything you and your colleagues do to make this forum so vital and valuable one. I believe we will be hearing from our first Secretary General of the year here in the forum, but we have already heard from 5 heads of state, current heads of state, and 14 former heads of state in this forum, and that is a tribute to the power of the Kennedy School's ability to convene under your leadership, Joe. I want to say, Mr. Secretary General, that I am a lot more happy with John Ruggie for succeeding in bringing you here than I am with you for succeeding in bringing Jeff Sachs to the United Nations. Jeff will be missed, and perhaps you will succeed where 29 years worth of Harvard presidents and deans failed in managing his creativity and energy. But I know that with him at your side, your ability to carry out the vital missions in which you are engaged will be enhanced. You know, there are times when there is a profoundly important mission, when there is a profoundly important organization to carry out that mission, and when there is the right man to lead that organization. This is such a time. Global peace, global opportunity, human development, these are more important challenges than they have ever been. None of us were able to remember as we stood out there who it was who said that the United Nations was the last best hope for mankind. But whoever said it was surely right. And it is all the more true if we think today about challenges like AIDS, if we think today about what is happening in the Middle East, if we think about what has happened in Africa over the last 2 decades. And I think there are many leaders who could win an election in their country and who are revered in their homeland. There are few who could get the kind of standing ovation you get wherever you speak in the United States in almost any country in the world. And that is a tribute, Mr. Secretary General, to your moral force, to your commitment, and to your capacity for leadership and vision. If it can be said of anyone that they are making a difference for humanity in this world, it can be said of you. Just yesterday, the world reached an important milestone. The Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, an organization which would not exist without Kofi Annan, made its first major set of funding commitments. These commitments will, for the first time, support the use of highly active antiretroviral therapies for HIV-infected individuals. As the Secretary General would recognize, this accomplishment, as important as it is only a start with respect to what the world needs to do. And I am so glad that large numbers of Harvard students are working together to mobilize support for this morally important challenge. In the tradition of the Godkin Lectures, of addressing profoundly important topics involving government and public policy, Kofi Annan could not have chosen a more important topic. He will address us on globalization and governance in Africa. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. President Summers, Dean Nye, John Rugged, ladies and gentlemen and dear friends. Thank you very much, Larry, for that very warm and kind introduction. I am pleased and honored to deliver the annual Godkin Lecture. I'm also delighted to join Joe Nye in welcoming John Ruggie to the Kennedy School, though I do it with mixed emotions. We greatly miss you, John, in New York. And when is your next sabbatical? Are you going to give him one? I know that you will all benefit from his scholarship and energy. Like so many people everywhere, you at the Kennedy School have been grappling with globalization and its discontents in recent conferences and meetings, as well as in your classrooms. You appreciate that globalization as we know it today is not sustainable. It needs to be less disruptive and more equitable. It needs to support not only private wealth, but also public goods. We have learned that managing the adverse consequences of globalization while still reaping its benefits requires not less governance, but better and smarter governance. So it is a special pleasure for me to address you on an issue of governance. This is a critical area for the United Nations mission in the 21st century. All our work for development and peace has taught us that if the issue of governance is neglected, then we are building on sand. No amount of aid and no degree of diplomacy can produce lasting progress if it is not rooted in legitimate, rule-bound institutions responsive and accountable to the people. Africa has had a strained relationship with globalization. As a continent, it is less integrated into the global economy today than it was a decade ago. Insofar as it is largely through commodity exports, which works to the disadvantage of African countries as commodity prices have fallen steadily. Half of all Africans have never made or received a phone call, and less than 1% of Africans have ever logged on to the internet. Nowhere is it more important, therefore, to ensure the benefits of globalization are shared at every level of society. Governance is at the heart of this challenge, and today I want to talk to you about how Africans are placing governance at the heart of their efforts to renew their own societies and to reform their economies. The struggle for democracy, development, human rights, and good governance in Africa may well be reaching what has been called the tipping point. Important progress has been made not only in practical terms, but also in the determination of Africans to see their countries share in the opportunities that a globalized economy can provide. Citizens throughout Africa are demanding the rights and obligations of free men and women, and they are being heard today perhaps more than ever. African leaders are engaged in a serious effort to learn from past mistakes and to chart a future based on the rule of law and good governance. We are all tempted to talk and think of Africa in monolithic terms, and yet the reality is far more diverse and complex. There are immense differences among African countries in progress and political development, as well as social and economic reform. While some remain mired in ways of the past, many others are being transformed by new public demands and responsive political leadership. We are today seeing important progress in resolving long-standing conflicts from Sierra Leone to Angola, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Eritrea and Ethiopia, all of which are necessary to create the space for political and economic reform. Increasingly, African societies are led by democratically elected leaders, accountable to their peoples and guided by public interest. The military has returned to the barracks in most countries, and attempts to undermine democratic gains have been met with resistance from the people determined to see their rights respected. And several years ago, the Organization of African Unity at the summit level passed a resolution indicating that they will not accept or welcome into their midst any leader who took power by force. And it was so refreshing to hear the African leaders talk in terms of each game has its rules. And even in soccer, if someone misbehaves, you show them the red card and you don't entertain them. And we should not do this. And it has made a difference on the continent. What all this amounts to, in my view, is a new spirit of democratic empowerment throughout Africa, a spirit that can sustain belief in progress even in the most difficult of times. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, the principle of democracy is universally recognized. The right of all peoples to take part in the government of their country through free and regular elections is not peculiar to any country. Throughout Africa, we are seeing people demand the right to choose their leaders, to hold these leaders accountable, and to demand efficiency and transparency from their governments. Africans are demanding genuine democracy, meaning not least that elections, when held, should be free and fair, and so that they can be relied on to reflect the genuine will of the people. However, Africans, and not just outsiders, are beginning to say that for democracy to succeed in Africa, an electoral mandate alone is not enough. For elections to be genuinely free, and for the people to feel genuinely represented in government, much more is needed. Institutional checks and balances, an independent judiciary, viable political parties, a free press, and the freedom of each individual to express his or her ideas without fear of retribution. Africans have seen in the past how democracy is betrayed, even if its forms are respected, when elected governments allow corruption to thrive and fail to address the basic needs of the population. Indeed, some institutions of democracy in developed as well as developing countries can be abused to harm human rights, especially when minorities are excluded or marginalized, whereas inclusive democracy is the best mechanism for advancing and securing human rights. In Africa as elsewhere, we have learned from painful experience that authoritarian and highly personalized forms of government, ethnic discrimination, and violations of human rights have been root causes of conflict. Conversely, Africans, like others, have also learned that only democratic governance, by protecting minorities, encouraging political pluralism, and upholding the rule of law, can channel internal dissent peacefully and thus help break the cycle of conflict and poverty. What is encouraging about recent developments in Africa is that the pressure for good governance is no longer coming from one side or the other, but from peoples and leaders alike. The spirit of democratic empowerment is challenging all leaders to live up to the ideals of independence and to deliver the freedoms and the rights and opportunities their people deserve. The spirit of democratic empowerment that I referred to earlier cannot, of course, on its own transform Africa's prospects. Just as important is the fact that Africa's new resolve begins with a sober and realistic assessment of the social and economic challenges facing the continent. First, poverty in Africa is widespread and severe. Africa is now the region with the largest number of people living with $1 or less per day. Although the average economic growth in Africa did increase in 2002 to 3.1%, that is still far short of what Africa needs if it is to meet the Millennium Development Goals of halving poverty by half in 2015. Second, too many African countries remain caught up in conflict or have only recently emerged from periods of violence and instability. From the destruction of infrastructures and roads to the mass displacement of some 17 million people, Africa's search for development continues to be impeded by war and conflict. Third, while many African countries still depend largely on ODA for their hopes of development, that assistance has declined dramatically in recent years. In 1999 alone, aid to Africa dropped by $1 billion compared to the year before. The decline in ODA to Africa applied not only to countries in conflict, but also, and perhaps most distressingly, to those acknowledged to be making determined efforts to improve their policies. The recent announcement of increases in ODA by the European Union and the United States at last month's Monterey conference offers some hope that this downward trend will be reversed. The Monterey consensus recognized that Africa needs additional assistance to be given a hand up through capacity building and additional ODA, debt relief, market access, and foreign direct investments. This is particularly important since Africans would much rather trade themselves out of poverty rather than live on a handout. They want economic empowerment as much as political empowerment. African countries urgently need increased access to markets of the developed countries if they are to diversify their economies and create jobs for the soaring number of unemployed. Yet too often, their access to the markets of the developed countries remains blocked by a combination of continued protection, subsidies paid to producers of the developed countries, and technical standards imposed by important countries. It was therefore encouraging that an agreement was reached in Doha to negotiate substantial improvements in market access, allowing poor countries to compete on a fair basis. Doha has a promise. Doha also recognized that an open door is not enough. Poor countries will need assistance to build their capacity to benefit from trade opportunities. I believe the Doha and Monterrey conferences have put new life in international economic cooperation for the eradication of poverty, cooperation that is bound to benefit Africa, the continent that faces the greatest development challenge in the 21st century. Finally, there is the almost overwhelming challenge of HIV/AIDS that we heard President Summers talk about. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the region most severely affected by HIV/AIDS. In 2001, according to UNAIDS, approximately 3.4 million infections occurred in Africa, bringing the total number of people living with AIDS in the region to 28.1 million. The pandemic is affecting the demographic structure and has placed increased demands on the already overstretched public health services and facilities, and I would recommend the study done by Jeffrey Sachs on health and development, and I think that drives home the point. Even more devastating is the fact that HIV is claiming the lives of many of the most productive and creative people on the continent. My dear friends, it is clear from what I have described that in Africa today, challenge and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. Africans are more aware of this than ever before and are genuinely engaged in these issues on their own terms. First, they are addressing the conflicts in their midst by coming together as African leaders determined to solve their own problems. In Burundi, we have seen a process led by late President Nyerere and then by former President Mandela. In Sierra Leone, regional leaders, in cooperation with the United Nations, are stabilizing that country, and they will have elections in May this year. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, President Mbeki of South Africa has invested great efforts in promoting the inter-Congolese dialogue led by former President Masire of Botswana. And in Eritrea and Ethiopia, a conflict that killed 80,000 people, an African-led mediation effort ended the war and led to the introduction of a UN peacekeeping mission. Since then, the two countries have accepted a boundary commission's findings on delimitation, and over the coming months, the border will be physically demarcated on the ground by a United Nations assistance team. These are examples of constructive cooperation on which Africa must build, and the African leaders must continue to work and as they confront the crisis of the future, whether they are emerging from conflicts or threats to the democratic process. Second, Africans are confronting the scourge of HIV and are deeply conscious of the threat it poses to the very future of the continent. Several countries in Africa have been at the forefront of social mobilization against it. They have fought back with innovative national AIDS program and community initiatives for both care and prevention, including relentless campaigns of public education that reach every man, woman, and child. And I think the rest of the world is beginning to take notice. And each time I meet an African leader, I challenge him to speak up on this, because silence, in this case, silence on AIDS, is death. Silence is death, and more of them are speaking up. I recall not very long ago, an African head of state was given a speech to read out, and one of the paragraphs talked about the use of condoms. It took them 2 weeks to convince him to agree to talk about condoms. He said, "I'm the father of the nation. I cannot encourage the children to be promiscuous." But he couldn't see the point immediately that he was also saving lives and protecting future generations. In the end, he did it, and he's much more relaxed about it now, and he talks about it much more often. Third, Africans are developing new initiatives aimed at securing lasting development and economic integration. One such initiative is NEPAD, the new Partnership for African Development, a partnership whose principles can pave the way to a brighter future for Africa. The significant innovation of NEPAD is its belief in partnership within Africa and between Africa and its partners. It calls for a new partnership between Africa and the rest of the international community, especially the highly industrialized countries, to overcome the development chasm that has widened during centuries of unequal relationships. It calls for a relationship based on the understanding that development is a process of empowerment and self-reliance. This partnership is also to be based on accountability for agreed development goals, including peer review and performance monitoring, both among African countries and between them and their international partners. These efforts at accountability reflect the desire of African leaders to be judged on their performance and to help each other before asking for help of their international partners. To reinforce democracy and governance and facilitate effective implementation of the various standards and codes, NEPAD's leaders have also committed themselves to strengthening parliamentary oversight, promoting participatory decision-making, adopting effective measures to combat corruption, and undertaking judicial reforms. What is important about every one of these challenges facing Africa is that they are being met with African-led initiative which emphasizes responsibility and ownership on the part of African leaders and citizens. The partnerships and programs that will succeed in responding to Africa's future and Africa's future needs must focus on helping Africans improve their own capacities and institutions. Although capacities are improving in African countries, much needs to be done. For instance, there is a need to strengthen parliaments, judiciaries, systems of public finance, and institutions of higher learning. And the academic community can do so much to help, beginning with the pioneering work and the scholarship of W.E. Du Bois. I think I say Dubois, but I think you call him Du Bois. Yeah. A Harvard graduate who played a very important role in deepening our appreciation of Africa's history and our understanding of its future prospects. I hope you will pay more attention to Africa in your planning and in your own research programs, which can contribute to solving Africa's problems, and by establishing links with African educational institutions. And I hope you would also help Africans build up their capacity to solve their own problems. Many African universities were once famous centers of excellence, but most of it is all gone now. We have a situation where the older professors are retiring, young ones are not going into teaching academia, and we need to find ways of rejuvenating the faculty, renewing the faculty. And I think about 4 foundations led by Carnegie have come together trying to raise $100 million to focus on this effort. And whatever you can do from here to help will be extremely helpful. And I believe NEPAD would also offer us an opportunity through which we can reinvigorate these institutions. And networks of specialized research and higher education can also be promoted, and I hope we can count on you. I cannot think of a better institution of higher learning in the developed world than Harvard and Kennedy School to launch this kind of partnership. My dear friends, Africa's future will be determined by Africans, enabled and empowered to build a future of democracy and prosperity based on the rule of law and good governance. To build this future, to defeat conflicts, cure the diseases, and alleviate multiple hardships that have held the continent back, Africa will need to summon all the wisdom, political courage, will, and creativity that it can muster. But it will also need the support of the developed world in an effort that is grounded, as I said earlier, in a sober, realistic assessment of how to achieve lasting progress. The reality of globalization has made it clear that we cannot ignore the challenges and crises of other parts of the world, and if we do so at our own peril. Even more, it's become clear that opportunities for growth and innovation exist everywhere, as long as we end conflicts and create structures of governance that can sustain lasting development. Africans today are showing courage, determination, and responsibility in their struggle to lift their countries out of war and poverty. Supporting these efforts have never been more vital to the interest of the developed world and the international community. Let us together do all we can to help millions of people throughout Africa to improve their lives so that a continent so rich in human and natural resources can truly fulfill its promise. Thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary General, you've done it again. After I heard your speech at the Nobel Prize ceremony in Oslo in December, I thought that was the top, but you keep surprising me. There's more and more to come. We now have time for questions and answers. There are 2 mics here on the floor and 2 on the balconies. And before you ask your question, I'd like you to identify yourself and your relationship to the university. And I would like to remind you that questions are short, to the point, have a question mark at the end, and come 1 per customer.
Take several questions and then answer them. So we can
All right, what we'll do is Secretary General says he'll take several and collect them and answer a cluster at a time. So let's start here.
Sure. Thank you. And Mr. Secretary General, thank you for coming today. My name is Josh Weiner. I'm a junior at the college, and my question is about the Middle East.
I thought you would ask about it.
Israel certainly contributes to the cycle of violence when it attacks the Palestinians, but we've also seen that the cycle of violence is not broken when it does not attack the Palestinians. That is, the Israeli civilians are subject to the same attacks even when Israel keeps a ceasefire on its side. So my question to you is, why do you and the UN condemn Israel when it takes defensive measures to stop the Palestinian terrorist networks? And recently that the PLO has been linked directly to these terrorist networks. And what actions do you think Israel should take instead to protect its civilians, given that it has been attacked in either case? Thank you.
Are any of the other three mic people on the Middle East?
Okay, then maybe I better get
Yep,
this out
there.
of the way before. First of all, let me say that the UN and I as Secretary General, we've always condemned suicide bombings, and I've indicated that it is morally repugnant and any deliberate attack on civilians, killing civilians, making sure they are scared, there is terror, and creating chaos and mayhem is against international humanitarian law, and it's a crime. It's terrorism, pure and simple. But we have also indicated that Israel does have a right to defend itself. But in exercising that right, it has to be careful not to use excessive force where innocent civilians also get caught in the middle. In trying to deal with this, any use of force that goes beyond what is absolutely necessary for the military objective, where civilians get killed and got hurt, is also illegal. You can't defend yourself. We cannot say the means justify the end. The means can taint the objective. And I think what is important here is that we do condemn suicide bombers, and we do condemn excessive use of force. And I was at the Arab Summit in Beirut, and I did appeal to the Arab leaders to condemn suicide bombing and declare it as a terrorist act. So I have no compunction about that. But I think in the long run, it is not the use of force that is going to bring peace and security to the Middle East. There's no military solution. We need to put on the table a package that will deal with the aspirations of both sides. Security for Israel, to live in peace in a with recognized border, and insecurity with its neighbors. We need to also deal with the aspirations of the Palestinian people to their own state and the two states. And everybody now agrees to the vision of two states living in security, recognized, and the Arab states have come forward to say we will recognize Israel when we do make peace, which is a very important contribution. I firmly believe that if the Saudi Arabian proposal had been around when President Clinton tried so hard in Camp David and then Taba, we probably would have had a deal. Chairman Arafat needed to be reassured that the other Arab states are with him and that he has cover and he was not taking risks to be denounced. And now we have that. So no military solution. Suicide bombing we condemn. Excessive use of force beyond what is required to deal with the terrorist nets we also condemn. And this is why today we are talking about sending a fact-finding mission. The Security Council gave me a mandate to see what happened. I wish that had not been necessary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Left Dalton.
Good evening. My name is Arash Farah, and I'm a first year at the business school here at Harvard. Today in class, we studied the example of Malaysia and their use of capital controls in 1998 and their withdrawal from the international economy. One thing we learned in that case is many African nations have been slow they also use have capital controls in effect and have done so for the past 30 years. My question is, do you believe that African nations are justified or may need capital controls in order to grow their economy, or is the use of capital controls anathema to effective participation in the international financial architecture?
It's interesting you use a case of, you bring up the case of Kuala Lumpur. You may not believe it in this, what I'm about to say. My country, Ghana, and Malaysia got independence about the same time. Our economy was about the same size. Look at where Malaysia is today and where we are. And it has something to do with also stability. We went through many coups d'etats, question of mismanagement and conflict with Indonesia. Malaysia has by and large avoided and has had strong leadership, but they have followed far better policies than we did in Ghana. On the question of controls, The international market and the international financial institutions have tended to discourage use of these controls. And governments have been reluctant that if they do take initiatives which are not, I know I have a Larry here, which are not universally or generally accepted, they might find it even harder to attract investments and to get support. Chile, for another example, Chile did have some controls and it's managed reasonably well. I think this is an issue that governments are talking about and looking at, but I don't think that it's a solution that every country can apply. Malaysia is in a relatively advantageous situation compared with some of the African countries. I think if they did that, they'll probably see end to even the minimum flows that are going in there. Thank you.
Right, Daphne.
Good evening. My name is Amit Borde. I'm a graduating student here at the Kennedy School. And in my opinion, the world in which the United Nations was created is substantially different from the world that we live in today. Power dynamics, population dynamics, the representation of the world's population on the Security Council, issues and concerns, conflicts, etc. we face are very different today. So I would really like to hear your perspective on the role and relevance of the United Nations as an organization today and the power of it, and also some idea of a vision where you would like to see the organization.
That's a big question. No, I think when you started, I thought you were going to talk about reform of the Security Council, which I think everybody agrees, but they don't know how to go about it. So I've asked Kennedy School to do some work, some research for us. And so I'm hoping that all you guys will give us a solution of what to do about it, since we all agree that there should be a change and reform. But beyond that, we haven't been able to agree on anything. I think you are right that the UN is living in a different era. And I think it was with that view in mind that in the year 2000, we organized the Millennium Summit. I took the decision in 1997 that at the turn of the century, it would be good to bring the world leaders back to the UN, our shareholders as it were, and pose the question, what should the UN be doing? What should our priorities be? And what should we focus on? And that was what led to the production of the report, We the Peoples. And John Ruggie, who was with me at the time, had a lot to do with that, with the study. And I promised them that I would give them that report 6 months before the meeting took place, and I wanted them to review it and give us a mandate. Out of that came the Millennium Declaration, telling us what we should focus on. And we have well-defined Millennium Development Goals, including alleviation of poverty. And for the first 15 years, we're going to declare a major war on poverty, reducing it hopefully by 50%. It does require resources. It does require organization. I told the member states it was great for them to give us the Millennium Declaration and the goals, but they had to implement it. They had to do it in their own countries, and we will work with them. It is not something they leave to the Secretary General and the Secretariat and say, do it. The UN, after all, is a member state. But I think for the first time, we have clear objectives, at least for the next 15 years, and we have told them we will monitor and give annual reports as to where we are succeeding and where we are failing and why. And what is even more important is the entire international community has accepted the Millennium Development Goals as a framework for our development efforts. The governments have accepted it, the World Bank and IMF are all with us, and Bretton Woods. So we really have an important vehicle here. And I think people tend to think UN's efforts are only peacekeeping and sending out troops. 80% of our efforts is on economic and social efforts. And we are going to be focusing a lot on this. We cannot continue to accept a situation in this world where we have extreme poverty and immense wealth living side by side, where we see millions marginalized, and expect that in the long term, people will accept it, and we can continue business as usual. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing, apart from the poverty issue of governance, peace and security, and a whole range. But I would recommend that you read the document, We the Peoples, as well as the declaration. And I would appreciate your comments and views once you've read it. Thank you.
Welcome, Swanee Hunt,
Hi.
the Director of the Women in Public Policy Program. It's good to see you, too. On the ground level, African women stand out for their energy and their creativity, and I know that you believe that equitable globalization requires new leadership, and particularly that of women. I'm convinced that you believe it.
You are right.
The
How can I
second part-
disagree with you?
Yet, of your 61 special and personal representatives and envoys of the Secretary General, only 3 are women. Now, as you said earlier, every game has its own rules. So will you help us all here understand the unwritten rules at the UN that have prevented an enlightened Secretary General from bringing women into these important positions?
Well, let me first start with your figures, that of the 61, only 3 are women. We have quite a few women in UN leadership. We are trying to get to 50-50. We are at the professional level, we are at about 41 or so percent. At the leadership level, we are about 36%. I meet with my cabinet, as it were, once a week, every Wednesday, and we pull in those colleagues from Geneva, Nairobi, and others through teleconferencing. And we have had a very strong presence of women. If you are referring to some of the field operations,
Right.
yeah, some of the field operations, then you are right. We have quite a few women deputies. I had 2 women representatives who resigned, and we've been trying to look for opportunities to replace them and build this thing up. And they did very good jobs. And one of the areas of priority is to get some of them into operations like leading the operations in Afghanistan and others. And so I agree with you that we need to do better, and we are pressing it. But on the whole, when you take a look at the leadership position from Mary Robinson to Ogata to Obeid to Bettini, who just left us now, we have quite a few in leadership position, and we're going to do better. And what I would also say is that often the UN gets blame. When I gave the figures that we have 40 or 32%, we have 189 ambassadors in the UN from the governments that give us our guide. Only 10 of them are women. And we keep telling them, when we are positions, they send us male candidates. We are doing our own search. And I would encourage all of you in particular, if you have, send me, let's make a deal. Send me good candidates and good names, and we will improve.
It's a deal.
Okay.
My name is Anthony Arnold, and I'm a second year at the college. And earlier you mentioned the Monterey Conference, and I was wondering, there are a few critics of the conference who saying that the conference didn't come up with a proper formulation of concrete policy recommendations, things like that.
Country policy.
Yeah, concrete policy. And I was wondering what you thought the successes and failures of the conference were, and what the future prospects of financing for international development were in light of the conference.
I personally believe that the conference was quite successful for several reasons. First of all, the spirit was very good, and we brought the countries from the north and the south together. We had the private sector there and civil society. For the first time in many decades, we began to reverse the decrease in development assistance. Europe and the US announced important increases and projections for development assistance. There was also a commitment to do more on debt relief. Beyond that, it was not a consensus. We talked of the Monterey spirit and Monterey consensus. They worked in partnership. When some people refer to Washington consensus, they say that was imposed. This one was in partnership, and to see the North and South working in that respect, I think was really exciting possibility. They also talked about management of the global economy and attempts that should be made to ensure that the voices of the South and the poor are heard when decisions regarding the global economy are taken, and that they should not be brushed aside. I think anyone who was in Monterey thought that it was a reasonably successful conference. We also see what happened in Doha, Monterey, and what would probably happen in South Africa, where we are going to have the Sustainable Development Conference, all linked as part of our efforts as to how to implement the Millennium Development Goals. And so you have to see it in its comprehensive whole, and I thought it was quite successful.
Left balcony.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Alpha Turna, and I'm a third-year student at the college. I'm also a representative of the Harvard African Students Association, and I welcome you on their behalf. My question tonight is regarding Rwanda, and basically we had done a case in one of my classes where we're discussing what would happen if there was a renewal of genocide and what capacities the UN has to prevent such an episode happening again. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Also, if you have any regrets from the 1994 genocide, and last but not least, comment also on the ICTR and their progress in terms of reconciliation and truth and how they're doing.
Yeah. I think you've asked three important questions. Let me start with the first. How will the world react if there were to be renewed conflict in Rwanda? Will the world rush in a force? Will the world be ready to do what it takes to prevent it? The other question, even before you get to that, is what are we doing in Rwanda to reconcile? And I know that the president is working, is trying hard within because I think you have two issues. We have to reconcile societies to ensure that we do not get to these explosive situations where thousands and people get killed. What can we take steps? How can we take steps to ensure that our societies live in harmony and we don't have the kind of explosion and violent actions that you are referring to? How can the international community help? I think we should start there. And if that were to fail, and there were to be a second genocide, then the question is, how will the world react? We issued a report on Rwanda, which was made public, and the UN. I made my position very clear. Said I wish we could have done more, and we didn't have the capacity. And in fact, the Council hasn't discussed that report yet. But I did issue a statement on behalf of the UN, as we did for Srebrenica. Quite frankly, I cannot tell you that if tomorrow there were to be anything, that I will have the resources and the troops and the governments will be ready to go in. And this is why I will put emphasis on the first part, to reconcile, for us to make sure we don't get there and wait to see whether others will come or not. We do have a responsibility. In fact, I was talking to Professor Ignatieff where we set up. It was also it was part of the Rwanda experience where I indicated to the General Assembly that we may in some cases have a responsibility to intervene. And a commission which was set up by the Canadian government, and Professor Ignatieff was on that commission, very ably turned the phrase around, not humanitarian intervention, but the responsibility to protect. Sovereignty means responsibility, that governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens. And where they fail to do so, then the international community will have an obligation to go in and assess. But will the international community have the will and to provide the capacity and the resources? The capacity and the resources are, but will the political will be there at the critical moment when it happens? Really, it would be deceptive on my part to say, yes, I know it will happen. I can't be sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right balcony.
Mr. Secretary General, my name is Ryan Friedrichs. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. My question is about water. specifically a view expressed by Senator Paul Simon in this forum earlier in the year that in the coming century, water will be a catalyst for war or a catalyst for peace. And that currently, something like 430 times the number of young people who died in Columbine die every day because of lack of access to clean water. And I'm curious if you agree with his view, and if so, what the United Nations can do and the world can do to prevent water from becoming a catalyst for peace in the next, or prevent it becoming a catalyst for war in the next century.
No, I share that view, and there are so many countries in the world today that are already water distressed. And you probably hear the saying that the next wars are going to be over water, not over oil, and that we need to manage water better. We need to protect the water tables which are dropping. We need in our agricultural practices to use water more effectively, because we can get more crop per drop if we manage it properly. And in fact, in quite a lot of the developing countries, there's no water management at all. Rainwater is not captured. And so you live certain months of the year with lots of rain and floods, and other times nothing at all. And we are not able to plan ahead. We don't even use it effectively for irrigation. And this is going to be one of the major topics at the Johannesburg conference. And water is very much part of our sustainable development schemes.
I should point out that your next questioner is an African who is studying development here at the Kennedy School.
The continent is going to need you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Dalmasio Benicio. I'm from Guinea-Bissau. My question to you is, you talk a little bit about the conflicts in Africa, and that has been a major problem in my region of Africa. Sales of small illegal arms have been fueling and prolonging many of these conflicts. By some estimates, over 80% of those sales comes from the 5 permanent member of Security Council. My question to you, what do you think is the responsibility of these nations in helping stop the conflict?
I will write down your question and give it to each of them to give me an answer, which I'll mail to you. I'm just kidding. No, obviously, we are trying to curb the proliferation of these small arms. And in fact, we had hoped that at some point we could have gotten a sort of movement, and that led to the banning of landmines. Because this proliferation of small arms is not only fueling the conflicts that you have referred to, it's part of the drug smuggling concept. It is linked with drugs, is linked with criminality in cities, as well as in the conflict area. In my report to the Security Council on sources of conflict in Africa, one of the recommendations I made was that no African country should spend more than 1.8% of its budget on military, really trying to cut. In fact, I recall Michel Camdes saying this is very great, and I will be repeating it to the governments when I see them. And of course, quite a lot of it is smuggled, but there are others that goes through legal means. And the council members, including the Permanent 5, are aware of this problem, and our efforts to curb and control the flow. We haven't been entirely successful, but I think the pressure should be maintained.
Good evening, sir. My name is Johanna Odonko Sonika. I come from Ghana, and I'm an MPA
Nice to meet you,
student.
compatriot.
Thank you. I'm an MPA student here at the Kennedy School. We in Ghana are very proud of your achievements as Secretary General of the UN. My question to you is, what role, if any, do you see yourself having in the development of Ghana after your term as Secretary General?
You really want to know?
Many Ghanaians would like to know.
I will go back to an old dream I had, a farmer, and really help with agriculture. That's really what I would want to do. I think it will be fun. And not only that, it will also be useful, I hope. Thank you.
That's what my father is doing as well.
Maybe he can teach me a trick or two.
Well, I'm interested in your answer because I was going to invite you to come to the Kennedy School.
haven't finished it. We will move the Kennedy School to the farm.
Left balcony.
Good evening, sir. My name is Michelle Schwartzman. I'm a student at the Kennedy School.
Sir, can I ask you to start again?
Push your mic down a little bit.
My name is Michelle Schwartzman. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I would like to ask you why the UN denied the existence of a tape that would shed the light on the kidnapping of 3 Israeli soldiers in October 2000 by the Hezbollah forces for nearly 8 months.
Oh, back to Middle East, yeah. No, I think there was, I recall that incident clearly, and I also had discussions with the Israeli authorities on that. This is, for those of you who don't have the background, this was an incident that occurred on the Israeli-Lebanese border. As most of you may know, we do have a UN peacekeeping force on the border that has been an observer force. They've been there for many, many years. And when the Israeli government decided to withdraw from the border in accordance with Resolution 425 and 426, I decided that we will draw a blue line designating the border in accordance with available information as closely as we can. The blue line is about 90% in line with international border, and appeal to both parties to respect the line and not to violate it. 3 Israeli soldiers were attacked and kidnapped near the border in the area of operation of the UN observers. The UN observers saw an abandoned truck and picked up some items, and the incident took place on Lebanese territory. And the Lebanese, in fact, should be responsible for any crime and events taking place on their territory. We reported it to them, and also the Israelis said, we want to have all the items that the UN peacekeepers have. It may belong to the children. And they indicated that they had to look at it to see some of it the Lebanese government may need for investigations, and it was on their side. In the end, we gave quite a lot of the items back. It was allowed the Israelis to see it. But what I want to say is that because of the delay it took in the discussions, in fact, it took a long time for us, even at headquarters, to know that some of the items existed. Some of the Israeli authorities said there was a cover-up, but there was no cover-up. And I think it was one of these fouled-up approaches on the ground. And it is very clear that we wouldn't have any interest in covering up a kidnapping or not wanting to cooperate with the authorities. So that is the background of the issue.
Thank you.
This will have to be the last question in the right balcony.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Rahawat Tasfai. I'm an American-born Eritrean and a student here at the Kennedy School. Firstly, I'd like to thank you personally and the UN as the organization who has put tremendous efforts forward to secure a peace settlement in Eritrea, between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And now that this peace is finally at hand and the border has been legally deemed limited, my question is, what progress has the UN made towards the expeditious demarcation of the border in light of particular incidents following the ruling's decision, which were some provocative and inflammatory statements made by the Ethiopian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister? So my question is, what will the UN do to ensure that this peace moves forward?
We have appealed to both sides to avoid inflammatory statements. We already have a plane on the ground making overhead flights, and we are going to start the demarcation. The assessment I have got is to take about 6 months or so for us to complete the border demarcation. It's a long border, and the troops will remain on the ground until the demarcation is done, and we will only withdraw when that work and our work is completed. And I hope once that is done and the peace has taken hold, both countries can focus on the essential work of economic and social development, and in time develop the friendly relationship. Though you were once one country, you understand each other even though you speak different languages. And I hope that you will see this as a new beginning and a new start. And I think the international community will be very keen to work with both countries in developing their economy and social structures. Thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary General, we are delighted to have had you here for our Godkin lecture. We are also delighted to have such a good Secretary General, and we all wish you Godspeed. Thank you.